All right.
Hello, I'm Brent Andrews,
Amy Thompson.
Laura McGreevy.
and I thought we would just kind of maybe begin by reading the questions one by one. And I think last time it became a more organic process, which I think is good. But to begin, how can understanding how linguists conceptualize language acquisition and the various systems of language help you become a more effective literacy teacher?
So, Amy, I know you know a lot about the systems of language. Maybe you could kick us off.
Yeah. Um, I think it was chapter 3 was the one that really talked about the different systems of language, and I use it in everything that I do. So when I'm working with a student that has a language disorder, there's usually one of their systems of language is disordered. So, I really look at, is it semantics, syntax, pragmatics, where are their weaknesses? And I loved all the goals and areas that they put in that chapter. I was like, this is my life. This is what I do. I really like to do, with all my students, I try to really work on those meta-linguistic skills. So every session when students come in, we do synonyms, antonyms, we do a context clues, like defining a word that they don't know. We work on that. Multiple meaning words. And then I do something where it's syntax related. So it's either combining sentences or putting something into a different verb tense. Kids with language disorders, they don't have that ability to manipulate language. And so I really, with every kid that comes in, that's kind of how we start every session. I have it on my whiteboard. We go through it. I also do categories, classifications, word class, just to give them that practice sometimes of some of those basic skills, because they do struggle so much with different, and those kind of cover a lot of the different language systems. A lot of kids, especially in high school, they really struggle with syntax. So you see it in their writing where they just cannot do complex sentences, um, and then you think about with their reading comprehension, how if they can't understand those complex sentences, how that just impacts their reading comprehension.
Absolutely.
And so, I see a lot of times, like, unless it's like a very, like, the subject's first, then the verb, then the object, if it's that order, they get it. But if it's like a prepositional phrase or any the order is a little bit different, or it's a passive sentence, like, that's really hard for them to understand. And so a lot of times I see with kids in high school, at least, like, syntax is an area that I spend a lot of time on because they just really struggle with that. And I see it in their writing. I'm sure, Brent, you do too. And Laura, you probably do too.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I feel like this class is kind of helping me to think about ways to really break that down for them. And like, I'm thinking about how varied sentence structure if students can begin to vary their sentence structure, it can be a big glow up, in their writing. And so one of the things I'm working on actually with my case study student is just these like ways to transition. Let's say we're doing like a claim, evidence, reasoning paragraph. So kind of easy template for kids is, as you go into your evidence, what can we say? Okay, for example, comma. And then another, and I want to say, and I'll have to look, I feel like this strategy was one of the recommendations in one of the articles that we read. But it was like, oh my gosh, why didn't I ever think about this? A strategy for varying sentence structure and going into reasoning for kids is, instead of saying like, this shows such and such from the evidence, right? Teaching kids to go, since, right, whatever you have in your evidence, comma, and then connect it back to your claim. So just providing kids with more of these, like, kind of formulaic sentence structures, but then give them a way to vary their own sentences, but then also hopefully comprehend more
Mhm.
complex sentences.
I think they go hand in hand.
Yeah,
Like I
absolutely.
can see my kid, I'll be like, oh, look, there's that prepositional phrase. Because we work a lot with like prepositional phrases and then how to, with conjunctions. Because they don't always understand what does it mean if it says so, or what does it mean if it, although, like what does that mean? And so, once they have some practice on that, then they can identify it too when they read it. And I say, oh, there's although, what does that mean?
Yeah.
What do we think about when we hear that? And then it's like, oh yeah, like, you can see the light bulb kind of go on.
Yes. A problem I run into with this, so in 8th grade, it's the beginning of how to having to include a counterclaim. And so I do a lot of sentence stems with this, right? While some people believe that, and then you say, actually such and such. But a lot of times kids will want to say, while some people believe that, comma, but, and so it's like trying to explain what while or although means is really, really difficult. I need a strategy for that.
I have some practice.
Okay.
I have a lot of things. I would do that all the time. You're right. It's very hard for them. But I'll send you some stuff because I have like a whole task deck of those that are really helpful, and then it gives examples for kids to put to, like, once they go through the process they get it, and so I'll send it to you.
Yes, I mean, and that sounds like almost a way to like gamify it, which is so needed. And what kids are used to in like what they consider to be education, at least in a big class that's like engaging.
Yeah, and in that same structure, like we're still practicing constructed response using C-Seat, which I know you've used in the past, and just a lot of it is we give them we give them a space to write. These are like in a collab class, it's they struggle with the ability to do the things we're asking them to do, but also low motivation. And the more we provide structures like transition words for each step of CC, we have like a little model, and
remind us what CC. So I use CER. What's CC again?
Okay, so claim, setup, evidence, analysis, and tie up.
Oh yeah. So that's like the next step.
So it breaks it down into more steps, and it does include things like although or however, and therefore, kind of for the tie up, and teaching them to essentially structure their writing, and no matter what component it is, whether it's an essay with individual parts or whether it's a paragraph, just teaching them that there are structured parts of how we write and how we speak, and that we use transition words in everyday language and we need to use them in writing, but they still need those reminders. And we don't have them fill in the blanks. We try to make it where they know they can't write in that. We tell them, like, write in this space and it's blank, but we provide like a structure where it's like, here are some ways to begin each step. And and a lot of them just use those exact same words, and it's kind of like a beginning stage for them to start with writing. And I say beginning, but they're in 10th grade and you're teaching it. I'm sure they've had it before, but it's still they haven't reached like mastery or even proficiency of it, just like a working degree of how to use those. But the thing is, like, I notice that when they speak, they do the things I'm trying to get them to do when they write, and it's hard for I need more strategies. How do you make that connection between, like, you do these when you talk, like you don't think about it, but you do when you write. You need to do these, and and that's definitely something we also work on. The 10th grade used to be as prep for the, I mean, besides just being something to teach them, for the EOC, we would teach the counterclaim, counter argument, and now that the EOC is coming in the 10th grade next year, uh, we're obviously going to be assessed on it. Usually it was just like an introduction. And so we have to.
When was the EOC?
11th grade.
Oh, it's
American
10th? I
Lit.
didn't know that.
We'll be beginning next year with the rollout of the new standards.
Okay.
And it'll be 1 year of basically dormants. Like I think they'll take it, but it won't count.
Okay.
And the 10th graders now, who will become 11th graders, they just won't get assessed. So, but we do. I teach a very formulaic approach to the counter argument, but I use it as a quick way to just be like, look, with my advanced class, I mean my AP class in 11th grade, of like, hey guys, y'all are gonna have to take, and you don't have to do this after this year, but since the 11th grade class, like AP class, has to take the same EOC, even though it's not the same course. Georgia requires that they take it because their reading scores plummeted, and they're like, oh, we need the AP kids back. And so they've kind of made us squish American literature into AP Lang, which was not the same. And so I tell them that AP Lang doesn't focus so much on the counter argument as a one piece. It's more of an interwoven, how you explore different sides of arguments, and it's a more complex way of writing in the AP. But for the EOC, here's a very simplistic model, and here's how I did it, here's how a advanced student in your level did it, and kind of let them practice it without having to use all the steps. But when we use it in the 10th grade with our collaborative students, having those phrases really helps. And we just have a simple list of like 3 to 5 phrases and words for each part of a counter argument, like introducing an opposing claim and then the counter. And so that is definitely something in writing. Like, I was thinking about the connection between reading and writing a lot as I read this, the readings for this section. And it is such a connected process that I was curious. It looks like, I read the one about, have it somewhere, but it mentioned ornithography as one of the early stages.
Orthography.
Ornithography. Let's study birds. Suddenly, let's study birds. No, orthography, and and how basically writing is essential in assessing that, and just thinking about the balance one strikes as a early education teacher. It's really helped me as a high school teacher just to think about, okay, how do people learn? And now I'm seeing, like, now that I'm learning, like, oh, this is some key parts that these kids did not learn along the way, and now I have them in 10th grade, 11th grade.
Oh my God,
even 12th grade.
And they don't have, and this is kind of to seg into our next question, they don't have, and it's kind of everything you're talking about, Brent, kind of makes me think about, there are more and more articles now that go, okay, yes, we're all on board with the science of reading. How does that intersect with the science of learning? and thinking. And we know that we think with words. And so I'm so glad that the new standards too, K through 12 are going to incorporate academic vocabulary, as well as reminded me of what you were saying, Amy, about, how you assess kids who have language difficulties or disorders, but how much morphology can help. And so the new standards are going to they have very much laid out Latin and Greek prefixes, roots, and suffixes, and so that's going to be really exciting. I don't think in our career time we're going to see the effects of that of kids coming up, unfortunately, but I think we're headed in a right direction.
I know. And you're so right when you start really breaking it down and thinking about like the phonemic awareness and phonics and orthography and oral reading fluency, and you just think there's this whole generation of kids that just wasn't an emphasis for, and we see it because we have them, right? But then like how important having that systematic approach is, because it's really complicated. It's a lot of moving pieces, right? And so those teachers that are like teaching kids to read, I'm just like, oh my gosh, thank you. Like it's so much, it's such an important job, and it's really complicated. There's a lot of parts to it. And it's exciting that our district is finally like getting there. But like I said, we're probably going to be like ready to retire right when the first wave comes.
I'm ready to retire now. But yeah, I think that two things I thought of. One, I think in our last conversation I brought up, I try not to have conflict with my coach because, we had an administration last year that, while not very supportive of many things, they did listen to us when every single PLC and individuals complained about the same issues with the coach. They had a sit down with multiple PLCs and the coach, and it's actually, I don't have a planning period with anybody because I teach 3 things and they just can't work me in. But my team, there's 3 very rule following people, and they don't have conflicts with anybody. I mean, they're just really nice people, and they have been having conflicts, and they individually and kind of their team lead went and spoke to the English administrator, and were basically told, y'all need to get along. Y'all need to give grace. And that was like, a phrase he used, and be understanding. And we're like, well, where's our grace and understanding as professionals? We've been working in this district a long time. She's been working in this district 3 years, coming from a private military school. And, it's like, knowledge of this place and this county makes a difference. And, I had mentioned when I brought up the research that I'd been learning through this class, and how, morphology is an area I can really impact. I can work on that. And she was just like, no, we use vocabulary.com. And I'm like, kids just get in there and click through, and then they get rewarded for completion. They might not know anything, but we're rewarding them for the number of clicks they make, because that's all that
it's
thing.
Like the completion.
There are different ways to monitor, but the way the school is using it is to show which teacher spent the most minutes, how many clicks the class had, and which teachers are consistently on the leaderboard for time spent. There's nothing about how the kids are doing, or whether it's actually affecting
Yes.
their learning.
Mm-hmm.
And
Ironic recipe for dysfunction.
yes.
Uh-huh.
And when I went to the he doesn't have an English background, but when I started telling him, he's like, this is fascinating, like I want to learn more, and this is something we consider, but we have to have a hierarchy, and we have to, you guys have to learn to respect the authority of the people in positions and try what they believe works. And I'm just like, so I just do what I'm told,
Yeah.
by the coach, basically.
Yeah.
Mhm.
When I know from experience that kids aren't engaging consistently with vocab.com
Well, and
in a meaningful
Right,
way.
and it's frustrating because like we know that morphology works too, right? And there's so much carryover. It helps with the oral reading fluency because it helps them identify words faster and see those patterns.
Mhm.
It helps with their spelling. It helps with word definitions and reading, using context clues, vocabulary development. It's just one of those like skills that are like areas that if it has a lot of carryover, like it really impacts a lot of areas. You get a lot of bang for your buck. And it's too bad that they like can't.
Well,
But maybe with the new
Yeah.
standard changes.
That's what I'm
Yes,
hoping. When Laura
yes.
told me that it was explicitly in the standard, I looked and I
Mhm.
don't see it in the
Oh,
9 through 12.
really?
Maybe
Mm.
I need to look again, because the only time I've looked at the new standards,
It's in a strange format, like the
Okay.
suitcase or whatever. I've just barely tapped it. So,
Yeah.
I feel like it's going to be there.
If it's gonna be there, I really want to introduce that, because she is a stickler to standards, and
There you go.
and so if I can prove that, I think we can get out of this. But I still don't know, like, this administration really loves like easy shows of like loves the leaderboard, the national
Yes,
leaderboard. If
yes.
a teacher makes it on that for vocab.com, it's just
Oh,
like
gosh.
so they announce it over the
Oh, my
intercom
goodness.
sometimes, and in our
Yeah.
PLCs, it's part of, I mean, not our PLCs, in our department meetings.
They have
They'll
the
sometimes
hardest
mention
jobs, but like, whoo, sometimes they do them unfortunately poorly.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Um,
other thing I wanted to bring up was, okay, there was morphology, and then just reading about like how structured it is and how the blocks fit together, and it really is like building this foundation and then building the structure of a brain structure in the brain of how to do this task. And it's so I don't mean formulaic in a bad word, but in writing sometimes it's not good, but formulaic as teaching it is good, because it's like, oh, everybody follows these steps, and
Well,
And
that's
I'm-
why it's like a systematic approach is what all the research show, because it's so interconnected that you have to follow the system, and it.
And that's what I was
A lot of
wondering, is
pieces.
like, even learning about it in some of the chapters, just like from my, learning in other classes, sure, but as a high school teacher with not a lot of background in the science of teaching and teaching reading and the how the different skills fit together in the order you teach them. A lot of the stuff with phonemic awareness is like, I was doing that as a parent without knowing, without being taught or read. A lot of it seems, like just very gut level, like for an educated person, like, oh yeah, you need to be able to do this. And I'm wondering how, if
Or a
you're in
person who grew up in the 70s and probably had, phonics instruction
Really?
when you were
I don't
child.
remember it, honestly.
Right,
Well, even
and you
like
picked it up
Sesame
quickly, so you
Street
wouldn't
did
remember it
phonemic
well.
awareness.
Right,
You know, like
yeah.
they did sound it out, and the
Yeah.
letters would get closer.
Mm-hmm.
That.
But my question is, okay, if we're learning about it in these higher level classes, in, you know, like some of the readings, I was like, oh, this seems kind of basic. Then how is it being taught? And if we're learning about it this way, has
Like
it?
in a teacher prep program?
Yeah. Is it? I mean,
so
what are
differently
It
than
is.
our
I
teacher
think
Like in the-
now it
programs are
is.
Okay.
I mean, I think it is.
But what about like?
Yeah.
Let's say 20 years ago, like
Mhm.
you would still think if it wasn't if they're not using programs, it still seems like they would be doing the same skills. Like, how long has
Well,
it been
It
around?
depends. If your district has a curriculum that, like our district, that had use the pictures to tell what you're reading about, you know, that's what you teach, and you go away from the phonics and the
Right.
you know, because
after kindergarten, say. So it would be like, okay, well, this kid will have to get it through kind of the guessing method, you know, or like the in context kind of method.
but that was
Right.
the curriculum that they had to
Mhm.
use, and
Wow.
you still see books like that in some school. You know, like I mean, that's
Mhm.
what Beckett would come home like. The house is red.
Mm.
The house is green, and it was like a red house, a green house, a blue house. You know, like they would
Mhm.
teach them to use the pictures to guess what the words are that you're reading.
Right.
I remember
and I'm sure
stuff
that helped
like
them.
that, actually.
For many
a
kids, that
kid.
made it a sight word because it was like they were remembering it and they had that phonics background, right? So it was like cemented in their mind, I think. More so if they had already gotten the phonics piece, and then the like connection with the picture and the
Mhm.
word would like further cement it. But if you're a kid who had gaps in your phonemic or phonic understanding, then that wasn't helping you
Mhm.
really.
And you know, some, you know, they're like, well, they'll get it. It was like they'll just learn how to read.
Yeah.
And some kids do, right? Like
Yeah.
some kids do just learn how to read. You know, they're taught somewhat, but you know, they pick up on it really quickly. And then, you know, others that just are like, this is like reading Greek, you know, like they can't decode, and they just need that explicit instruction. They didn't get it.
Yeah. And I mean, we really saw that with our kids. Like, you know, we've got twins, but, you know, since Lily was held back, I often say our two oldest. But they, you know, we did lots of alphabet books, we did some sounding out, but they just took to it. And by the end of kindergarten, with like minimal whatever they were doing, 14 years ago, 15 years ago, then it just clicked with them instantly, and they were reading chapter books by the end of kindergarten.
Yeah.
And just
But not
just
with
going
Lily.
with it. But not with Lily,
Yeah.
and really not with Finn.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't the degree that it was with Lily,
Mm-hmm.
but she needed extra support, and so we kind
Mhm.
of saw these different levels within our own four
Sure.
kids,
Mm-hmm.
and they all had highly educated parents who were teachers, who were doing the things to emphasize the early
Mhm.
reading, and it just had different results
Yeah.
for the different kids, and
Mm-hmm.
so I wondered, like, yeah, you hear a lot more about the science of teaching, but I guess I always
Of reading.
I mean, science
we know what you
of
mean.
teaching
Uh-huh.
reading, yeah.
Uh-huh.
But I was like, it's almost like reading this. It almost is like it's like this new thing. Like, oh, this is how we do it, and I'm like, oh, is this? I mean, it makes so much sense to me
Yeah,
when
you're
I
like,
read about
oh,
it.
I
I'm like,
thought you were, that's
I
how you
thought
were
it
doing.
was. Yeah, I just assumed it would have been
Right.
approached that way.
Yeah.
Always.
Mm-mm. No.
Do you guys
Yeah.
have more for word analysis and vocabulary strategies before we move on to fluency, prosody, and how that impacts reading development and comprehension?
I was kind of curious. Like I was looking at in chapter 4, it was just a ton of structured assessments and a ton of strategies to teach word analysis, and it seemed like definitely like it was most appropriate uh, in the early grades, and maybe some of them would not be appropriate. I mean, not inappropriate, but for high school. So I was curious about, since Amy is working with kids that have a lot of disorders with language in the high school level, do you use some of those, I guess, assessments and strategies with our older kids on a one? I couldn't imagine doing it in class, but I could imagine maybe doing it on a one-to-one like tutoring.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. I do a strategy where I just have like a systematic approach to like what to do if you don't know a word. Like if you see an unknown word, you know, we look to figure out what part of speech is it. That's really hard for kids with language disorders. We look at the morphology. Are there any clues that we can see a prefix or a suffix, or do you know anything about the root of the word? And sometimes they might be able to say, oh, it looks like create. I'm like, yeah, so what would create mean? You know, so like we can do it that way. Sometimes we might look it up. We might say, let's look it up in the dictionary and see. And then I always, again, try to bring that metalinguistic, you know, either like, let's write a sentence with it, or I like to do the like create, like how would we make that into an adjective? What could we do to make it into an adjective, and using some of those suffixes, or you know, how could we make it mean the opposite? How could we, what if it's a person that creates, how could we make that into a noun? And so again, to help them manipulate and change it a little bit, and then say, okay, so we think this word is a noun, let's make sure our definition is that for a noun and not an adjective. Because sometimes they'll say, you know, if it's like a noun that they don't know, their definition will be like for an adjective, and I'm like, no, it's a noun. So how would we make sure that fits? So like that's kind of like, you know, again, I teach those steps hoping that they can, you know, and there's a lot of context. It's like, does it have a synonym? Is there a example in the sentence? Is it defined in the sentence? Is it, you know, so we kind of go through, I have like a visual that we go through. And so because the kids I work with need that explicit structure taught to them, but you know, you could do that and use that in your class.
Well, now that you're talking about it, we used to do that when we, even before I knew what morphology was, the word within a word, we were using all these word parts, and we were teaching them that each part was a clue, and you also need to look for clues. Like we would write questions where we would put a definition, almost a paraphrase of, okay, look for things in, you know, in commas. Like, is it spelled out as, you know, is the meaning like hinted at, or do you get a restatement of the word? And so very similar things. We didn't explicitly go through it, but we would give them items where we would tell them we gave them hints. There are hints and clues in each thing, and sometimes they would have to answer the question. Sometimes they would have to like almost do a task, and it wouldn't be like, what is the definition of this word? It was like, give an example of a time, blah blah blah. And they would have to apply knowledge of the word. And so we did focus a lot more on context, but again, the when technology started coming out, like it's hit you know, math, IXL, you know, with I guess with our content, vocabulary.com, there's more and more, and I'm not saying all technology programs are bad, but I do feel like some of the ones we're being asked to use as a way of documenting and showing progress because the computer saves it and makes these fancy charts, we are moving away from some of the research proven strategies that do help kids like become better readers. And that's something that I struggle with, is like, how do we get back to these kind of key skills in an age when I feel like more and more we're being expected to use technology programs that make it easier for people above us to see
Right.
data.
And that data is not accurate or does not accurately reflect the actual like reading comprehension or fluency that we're going to kind of transition into. And you know, these vocabulary.com kinds of programs are not having them speak the word and like embody that word. And one of my favorite articles of this entire set was, let's see, let me scroll down to it. It was repeated reading to improve fluency for readers. And this was just like a small qualitative study. But I think the results are really exciting. And it's just about having kids reread things, right, over and over, a high interest text to like improve their prosody. And this so reminds me of, so at the end of the year, after the big like milestones test, we're always kind of like, oh, what can we do that's like, you know, to continue to engage kids. And in the past we did this like shake hands with Shakespeare unit where kids are acting out a short scene, but it becomes difficult with getting the kids to work together. And so I proposed, why don't we have kids do a recitation? And I really feel like having kids even memorize poetry and perform it is so powerful. And of course, like people on my team were just like, what kind of like old person crap is that? And so of course, like, and I had some kids who just, there they are. Because they had to learn their piece. And because then it was like this bottom up kind of thing. They had to learn their piece, which they were interested in to start with. Then they had to understand it. And so then they had to embody it and they had to perform it. And we continued to work on their performance. I really felt like they gained a much better understanding of the words. And it also improved their confidence, you know. And it just also reminded me of, you know, you see over the course of many years, you'll see a young actor who doesn't seem to be very like academically oriented or whatever. And over the course of their life, well, after they play all these different characters, you know, by the end they're becoming like a director who's analyzing the themes and like the depth of character analysis. And I think it's because they have put the words, these beautiful words, into themselves and then become this person and then care deeply about, you know, the meaning of the words and how they interact with the other words in the scene. So I really love that.
And that is one of the strategies they talk about, is that like acting piece, like to act it out and to for that, you know, prosody and the tone and intonation and why that's important. And I love that. I can see how some kids were like, what? We have to perform it? But you do, you know, and you know, I'm sure you all have things that you memorized as a kid and you still remember them. I know my grandma like remembered all of these poems, you know.
Yes.
So there's,
I
like,
wish I'd done more.
Yeah.
Like, and if you start to recite something you remember, you know, your own kids or kids in the classroom will kind of perk up some, you know, like, what are you saying, you know?
Yeah.
Please keep that dog contained. We're doing a video right now.
Yeah, she's barking at us constantly. Do you mind taking her away? We love her.
The other thing that I can't remember what chapter it was, but it talked about reading stamina. And I thought that kind of came into that last question about trying to help readers and, you know, develop that reading stamina where they're not just giving up right away. And I see that all the time with kids. Like they just get frustrated, and
Heads down,
it's bigger than just reading, right? It's like that frustration stamina that they don't have tolerance to be frustrated or to
Right.
like not know something right away. And so, you know, when you read or when you're learning, it's that stretch zone, right? Like it's uncomfortable, you don't know it, you have to be willing to take that journey, right? And to be uncomfortable. And that reading stamina, it really made me think about, gosh, I see that all the time, because they're like, I can't read this, or it's too hard, or I'm
Yes.
frustrated, or, you know, they'll try it. And
Yeah.
you know, so I was thinking about, you know, how do we build that up? How do we create environments where kids feel comfortable struggling, kids feel comfortable not getting it and trying again, you know? And but I think that's like just a bigger problem with this generation of kids too, is like everything's so easy and they're, you know, rewarded, and you know, so like if that doesn't happen right away, they just are like, I'm done, this is dumb.
Yeah, and you're right, it is too hard. And so one of the things that we have been able to do to some degree in middle school, and I think it needs to be done more in high school, is, and we'll actually do it with my ELT. I have done it in years past, and now with the new curriculum, we don't have time to do it in regular ELA classes, but 10 minutes of class is independent reading, and it's at your independent level. And you can just see the kids like hating having no technology around them, and they hate the book for, you know, but gradually over time, they do build that stamina because it's like a book that they have chosen. It's always graphic novels right now. My class. But like, no, we're going to keep doing it, and you're going to have nothing else with the book. Hey, and I'm like, hey, pick 3 or 4 off the shelf, please. Like in case, you know, but yes, you're going to sit there and, you know, and I'll do a thing where I'm like, eyes on text, movie in your mind. And I know I can't read your mind, but like I have a way, you know? But yes, like just needing to practice sitting with it and having the experience of enjoying it, you know? Like so many kids come from backgrounds where, you know, they didn't really have access to that. No one like kind of sitting with them and like easing them into that enjoyment.
That's one of the things I like with ChatGPT is I'll say, at this reading level, create a passage about like some horrible video game that they love. That's all about killing it. But I'm like, hey, they're into it, you know, and it'll do a passage about, you know, repo. I don't know. One of my kids is into this like repo game with, I don't know. It's like you steal stuff and then repossess, like sell it.
That is so brilliant. Oh my gosh. I can't believe I've never done it.
Got him to read a whole passage on it. And you know, I was like, I'm so proud of you. Like you went through that whole thing, but it was because it was on this horrible game. You know, but it was like a connection, right? So I've been thinking about like what are other ways to get that like curiosity to stay intact so that they can keep working on these skills.
Curiosity to stay intact. Yes.
We're still like struggling to get back to, you know, we're doing independent read at all levels, and a couple of things. We had a major setback. Laura, you would remember my principal, Tony Price, and his wife, who was the associate superintendent. She's been a successful superintendent in other counties, but she hated independent reading. She thought there was no purpose for it. She said there's no purpose for reading.
Right.
It's a waste. It's a waste of time. She wanted instructional reading only, and he was a principal at a high school, at our high school, and he outlawed independent reading and said, if I come in there, kids are just reading books for no purpose. And we were so furious. We tried to fight him. We were like, there's always a purpose for reading.
Right.
But we started fighting back and using the stamina argument as these kids, you want them to do well on tests. If they can't sit for 30 minutes and read something they want to read, how are they going to sit for an hour and read things that are broken up passages of things they don't care about. Like, you need this. We need to teach them how to sit with it and stay awake and to interact with a text. And we made more progress, but eventually it was like not until they left that we got back into teaching independent reading or making space for independent reading again. And that was like 2016, 2015, 2016. And so, we have had a lot of turnover. We used to have so much collaboration in our department where we all did the word within the word with the morphology stuff. We all did, at least 3 days of independent reading, and we had set the time.
Not for the full class, I'm sure.
No. But that's what I was about to say. We had set the time at like 30 minutes, and when we came back, we found like kids, they couldn't do it. And a lot of teachers do 10 minutes to 15 minutes. I still try to go 25, but sometimes I'll just kind of watch the kids' body language, and you can see the whole class start to like squirm and writhe.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, it's breaking down. And we might do 20 instead of 25, but I've always tried to push 25 or 30. And I forget which article it was, or maybe it was in one of the chapters, but it was just a mention of, wrote it down actually, so it must have been one of the chapters, of how much one should have independent reading, and it was about stamina, and there was one thing that I highlighted that it's ineffective if it's used for too short of a time period. Like if they only have small chunks of reading each day, it was better to have longer segments.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and I wondered of course they have to build up to it. If you can't do it, you're just going to be fighting, behaviors, and it's not going to have the same impact.
Well, in years past, we would do independent reading Fridays, where we would have an entire class period almost, actually. Yeah.
I would have advanced classes that would, when we had that weird 45-minute Monday and Fridays, were you in the district when we had that schedule? Okay. And so it was hard to go from a 90-day and then 70-minute day. We had been teaching these 90-minute blocks, and then we went to 70, and then we went to 45, and it was really hard on those 45-minute blocks to get anything done. And we started doing more independent reading with a journal, and sometimes kids would be like, can we read the whole time in our advanced classes? And we would do like, we'd build up reading Mondays and reading Fridays, because it was a good way to kind of ease into the week and close out the week. But I'm really seeing a lot more, it's obvious that this hasn't necessarily been emphasized through, I know we're not emphasizing in our department the way we had been, but they're also wanting to measure it now through another technology program like Beanstack. They want to, log your minutes, but I was also reading about
it just becomes this like weird transactional thing then that's like
yeah, and I was looking at the reading logs, and basically even with independent reading, you want to teach reflection, you want to have them engage in some way with the reading, and with Beanstack, it's just like, it is more transactional. It's like log your minutes to get the, the excitement of seeing your level or your number go up, and I'm really rethinking it with my student teacher, or not rethinking it, but it's become apparent like there are practices that have to be in place, like when she learned about independent reading, she was like, oh yeah, that's great. I mean, it's not like she learned, she knew it existed, but she was like, oh, I'm glad you already have that spot, because I really wanted them to have a space to do that. But she's busy, and I've noticed she's over time gone to working on the computer like while they're reading, and I'm like, oh no, you can't do that. And we've had conversations about it, but sometimes it might be a preparation thing. Maybe there's something she feels like she has to do for the next step of class, but I have taken to moving from my desk, and I have a standing desk at the front of the room, and I just stand and read, and I try to catch her attention and be like, oh, I'm also modeling for you.
Right.
Like, you
Well,
do
and
this
that was
with them.
The last module, that was one of the things that it was like teachers have this incredible influence on readers, because and that was like, recommend a book, let them see you reading a book, talk about the book you're reading, and that had like the biggest influence on them wanting to read, because they saw their teachers reading.
Yeah.
Or if the teacher was like, oh, I just read the best book, and told them about it, like all of those things were modeling how to be a reader.
Yeah.
And
I'll tie that. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that was one of the things, that they're like, teachers, you're in this unique position to not only show them that you're reading, but to talk about it and to make recommendations and to like show your enthusiasm and love of reading.
Yes.
I used to do that with, they talk about think alouds a lot, and I did that with when my kids were filling out reading logs. It would be like a basic question, like, I've thought about ways after this program to, kind of restructure it using one of the strategies that I've kind of identified for my whole class, but also within the tutoring, and like it's called signpost, notice and note, and like these are things you should always notice in any text of fiction. And they have a nonfiction one, but kind of using that as a reinforcement of the strategy. But I just feel like kids need that 5-minute section of time to reflect on what they read and do something with it, even if it's just writing a summary. And we've really moved away with that and I don't fully understand Beanstack. Maybe there are ways that kids can interact on there. Do y'all use it?
It has been suggested by our principal, and I just haven't had time to dive into it.
I know
either.
You can recommend books on it to people.
And you can, I think you can even, like, students can do, like, like a Goodreads blurb for things, and you can track the books you read. And I assume maybe I just need to study it more. This is our first year kind of being expected to use it as part of our independent reading program. Like, it was introduced last year as there's this new thing, it's a possibility. And I'm kind of slow to like the gimmicky things, and I have
had kids on Goodreads, but then it gets a little glitchy when they're all on it at the same time for some reason.
Yeah, I have to see that it's got
I like the kind of like challenges where you could be like, read a book by a female author, or like read a book by a or read a nonfiction, because I mean, for me as a reader, I tend to read books that I like to read, I kind of and sometimes that's why I like being in a book club, because you read a book that you probably normally wouldn't have read, and that has so much value. So they have a challenge like that on Goodreads, but I wonder if you could do something like that on, like, by the end of the year.
Yeah.
Or like, and have a lot of different ways that, it could be a graphic novel, it could be, whatever, but a different like type of book that you maybe wouldn't read.
Yeah, and maybe it's like there has to be a combination. I mean, I do plan to, when I don't have so much going on, digging more into Beanstack and see if there is a reading response type thing. I haven't heard of that. I've just heard it, it's sold as like, that's how they track. They come and give these posters, and they give kids treats and things for getting the most minutes. But again, it's like, the most minutes, the most clicks, and I do feel like we're moving away from vital components of having kids
Yeah.
like do the meta analysis and the metacognition of what they're, and process it and show that they're comprehending it rather than doing it just for the,
The badge or
you
the
did it.
recognition.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, do you guys feel like we've covered, the questions pretty thoroughly to end, or did you guys have some more, kind of highlighted points that you guys wanted to talk about?
I guess, with for this class, my student, has pretty solid basic skills. There were definitely one of the things we're going to work on is the morphology because, she did well with like understanding words and being able to read them, but she really, and synonyms, good at that, but almost on the assessment I did, got no, like where they had to take the, like put in the blank another form. If a student is not happy, they are blank. Like, got none of those. And I was like, oh, that's a big thing.
Yeah.
That's a chunk she's missing. And, but most of her issues are around reading comprehension. And so, kind of with the fluency and the comprehension piece, I saw there was one of these articles was about reciprocal teaching, and although it wasn't exactly that format of reciprocal teaching throughout the article, just having kids in a group, like process a piece together, and that's kind of like what I'm doing in my class now as a intervention for the other class I'm teaching. I'm kind of balancing how can I use these different strategies for the whole class, and then how can I use a version of that to really help my one student. But one thing that it doesn't go smoothly. They're not really used to doing group reading, but having them stop in a text, and I'm still trying to figure out how much, like when can I move away from audio text, but right now we're using audio text and we're just walking around to make sure kids are reading and emphasizing that they have to have their book open and they have to be following along with the pages. And then we pause and we have these discussions using, the different signposts. Did you notice any signposts? And having these structured, I kind of moved away from reciprocal teaching as the way it's like outlined to something simpler, questioning the author for nonfiction, where when we do argumentative reading, just having them see the author as just another human who has an opinion. They're not an authority necessarily. You can still disagree with people who have higher skills and people who are accomplished and even published. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them. And having them process and using those, like these stop questions to really, do you agree with this? What are they saying first? How do you feel about it? What's some evidence? And and getting them to approach and to pause and to do it as a group makes it's kind of like a bridge between, like, it's a social activity, it's a class activity, and then hopefully getting individuals to use it on their own reading. But yeah, our students aren't great at doing these discussions yet. I mean, it still has to be heavily kind of guided by teachers and bouncing around the room from group to group. And then there's just like the fall off of, if you're not with them, they tend to be talking about something else.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
that's one thing I was just kind of wondering about y'all's experience. I know in your role it's more of a one-on-one, but what do you feel about that type of? I mean, I know they use group reading and with the littles, but wh- to what degree do you use it or feel like it's effective?
Reciprocal teaching, or like
Well,
the notice
just
and
all
note.
of those type
Mhm.
strategies. There's a whole group of them, but it's basically having kids approach a text in a small group and
Uh-huh.
having them have different roles or having
Uh-huh.
them look for different things
Uh-huh.
and then having discussions about that
Yeah.
text.
Not as much as I should because
Okay.
of what you talked about. Yes. I do find it to be super effective though, just working one-on-one, like if I'm just like, okay, we're gonna take turns. And I'll even say, gosh, I'm really feeling distracted today, and this is about the Civil War, and it feels kind of boring to me, so I tell you what, ask me questions about, and like I feel like it does then make that student feel much more responsible for what we're reading together, and have that kind of metacognitive processing of like, am I noticing stuff, am I engaged? But yeah, in terms of really holding like whole groups in a big classroom accountable to continually do that, it's extremely challenging. I was just going to tie it back though to like the notice and note things too. There's another study in this set of articles this time about academic vocabulary, and I'm in one of the articles it said that the more teachers use the academic vocabulary that they taught very explicitly, the more students use that vocabulary. So I'm kind of wondering, if we could gamify it in a sense of then saying like, all right, they're in their groups, and then like, let's say the notice and note is like, okay, there, what was an aha moment in what you all read today, and then can you incorporate an academic vocabulary word, let's say revelation or something is an aha moment, can you use the word revelation, or
Yeah.
I can't think of another, like, but that would be like an effective sort of higher level thinking word,
Right.
that like going around to groups or something like that.
Yeah, and I have, like I said, it's rough, but it's promising. Like these kids haven't had a lot of experience working in groups. Coming back from COVID was really hard to get
well,
kids
you have to
interact.
model it. You have to. I mean, like they don't just know how to like analyze something.
Right. And even what does analyze mean?
Right.
If you really try to explain that, it's like, and so if that week,
word to use,
yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And one positive thing I'm seeing is it is improving engagement, and like my student teacher was getting so frustrated, and I was like, hey, let's try to make it more, because she was like, I want them in rows. I feel like they'll be more attentive, and that was working. Like it was able to kind of cut down on behavior, but then particularly in one class, they just started shutting down, and I'm talking like 3/4 of the kids with their heads down, and we were like, this isn't helping. We're just waking them up all period. And now that they're in groups and they're in tables and they have roles, that they are more engaged. And I see kids that never did anything are now awake, and it's not always constructive, but it's like I'm seeing less heads down, and I'm trying to look at the positives and looking at how to build.
You have a role and you're going to be asked to produce something. You know what I mean? Like that wakes me up. Like, oh gosh, you know?
Yeah. Wakes some kids up more than others.
Right. Some kids won't, but some might be like, I need to.
Yep.
Yeah, and whereas I do have to move around and almost need a teacher per group at this stage of the early teaching process, I see less kids with their heads down. Like they're awake more, and it's like, okay, we're playing the audio. Like they were not wanting to do individual work. Like they were shutting down. And one thing I began to think about is like in the 10th grade, it's the year that some of them turned 16 and right before, and it's kind of the end of that choice, and a lot of kids are already making their choice, and it's sad to see, and the choice is to drop out. And I talk to some parents, and I hear parents in the 10th grade being like, I've been encouraging them to drop out because they're not doing this, they're not gonna do it, and all I do is get calls from teachers, and I think they just need to get a job, and I'm just like, we don't want to go there yet. Like,
Right.
let's keep them.
Yeah.
Let's try to encourage, but it's a real thing in 10th grade when you see that disconnect
know.
beginning to happen, and there's a huge drop off in our numbers between 10th grade
Yeah.
and 11th grade.
I've had kids say, "Don't call my dad because he's gonna make me drop out."
Oh, wow.
If I get one more phone call home, and I'm like,
Oh, man.
okay,
One of the things
like,
I've
dang, okay,
Yes.
like,
I've thought I want to work on is like, as we send you off, whether it's from middle school to high school or high school to dropping out, how do I send you off with like, here's a toolkit for continuing to improve your literacy for your life? And and even like a dyslexia toolkit, because I'm having to diagnose. I'm like, look, I know I'm not a doctor, but I want to teach you what dyslexia is and how it means you actually have some superpowers too that no one also told you about. But like how to continue to work on these things, because like you said, we're working with a generation who missed out on so many things. That like, what's the self-help component? And finally, like, Brent, you've had that brilliant idea in the past of like engaging seniors or kids who are leaving high school with some kind of like, how do we raise literate babies, and so maybe that's the last piece, and like, hey, by the way, when you have kids, like, here's some things to know about
And teaching
how to make
them,
sure they
like,
have a better go. And
this is something you can do for your kid.
yeah.
The more of this you do, like, even if you do one of these strategies that we teach, you just teach kids, you have books around and at various levels, starting from the cloth backed, like, baby books, and you teach them how to turn the pages, and that there's stuff over here and then it's over here, and I mean, anything you teach them before they get to school is going to make them more successful, and it's fun, and like, you can and my idea was to have them with a partner, and they read children's books to each other, and taking them on all these field trips, and trying to get them to find the like silly books about Walter the farting dog or whatever, and be like, you don't have to read boring things, and it doesn't have to be academic. You can have fun with your kid and be silly while teaching them.
And meanwhile, some of those kids might actually pick up on a couple of the things that they missed along the way. So I love that.
yeah.
Are you guys ready to close, or?
I think so.
So.
Okay. Thanks, y'all.
Bye.